RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. Welcome to part 2 of my trestle table build series. And in this video we're going to be talking about mortises. So in the previous video you saw that I cut out the legs and even started to shape them a little bit. But before I can finish all that shaping I need to mark out the tenons. But before I can mark out the tenons, I need to cut my mortises, which means I need to mill the material that are going to accept the mortises that will eventually receive the tenons. I hope that makes sense. So in this video, I have my milling started for the feet and the battens that are going to accept the mortises, and that's where we're going to pick up. So before I get started with the actual woodworking in this video, I'd like to address something that came up in the comments section for the previous video in this build series. A number of people there requested that I share the computer model for the design that I'm working on here. And that seems like a perfectly reasonable request at the outset, but there's one small problem with that. You see that the company that made the software that I used to make this design explicitly states in its user agreement that it can't be used for commercial purposes. And while I do make a paltry sum of money doing these YouTube videos that isn't at all concurrent with the effort that goes into it, still technically counts. So I can't share that design with you, and truth be told, I'd rather not in the first place, because this is a design that I spent many years learning how to do, developing my own design sense, and it's not the kind of thing I'd like to see copied, particularly not for profit. I would prefer that anybody who watches these videos takes any of the designs that they see out in the world and makes it their own. To straight up copy somebody else's design, particularly for sale, not only has a questionable legality to it, it's just a fucking rotten thing to do. So unless I explicitly invite you to copy a design as I did with the Build a Wine Caddy series, I'd really rather you didn't. See, I'm just trying to make some semblance of a living over here. So all that said, let's continue with the build. Okay, so I've been busy milling down some material to make into both my sled feet and the battens for this trestle table. So the table is going to have one batten and one foot at each end of it. And I started out with some 8/4 stock and I milled it down to about 4 centimeters thick. And I left all my stock over wide, in part because I'd like to do a little bit of grain selection here. Particularly with the feet, which are going to be in plain view most of the time. I'd like to have the grain running right down the middle of each of those feet as much as possible. I don't really want the grain kind of running off at odd angles if I can help it. So with these boards being over wide, I have an opportunity here to kind of straighten things out. So this is the way I like to do that. So I kind of eyeball the grain. There's a little bit of a cathedral grain going down the length of this. I don't know if you can see that right, but hopefully. And what I'm doing is I put a little pencil mark right in the center of that grain pattern on that end, and do the same thing right down here at this end. And then what I'm going to do is draw a line connecting those two, just like that. Now I want these sled feet to be about 8 centimeters wide. So what I'm going to do is use this as my center line to mark that out. So I'm going to put a tick mark that is 4 centimeters off to one side of that center line here. Do the same thing in the opposite direction, right there. And I'm going to do the same thing at the other end. This is a pretty fat pencil, which it needs to be because it's something I want to be able to see easily. Now I've marked 4 centimeters off of the center line at each end of the board to get my total of 8 centimeters wide. And now I'm going to connect those lines on either side of the center line. Oh, by the way, I also left this stock a little bit over long, so I'm going to be cross-cutting these to their final length after I've done cut these out in width. So come up here. So all three of these lines go at a little bit of an angle across the board, and it's such that when I cut them out along the lines, the cathedral grain is going to run right down the middle of them. And that is going to be the most attractive grain pattern I could have for this particular furniture part. So here I've done that to both of these. Now I'm going to go over to the bandsaw and cut along these lines just a little bit off of them. I don't want to overcut, of course, and make these too narrow. Now I'll clean that up with a joiner plane, at least one of them. Make sure it's square, and I can use it as a reference from which to cut the other side. So that's what I'm up to. Okay, to do a quick recap of what you just saw, I went to the bandsaw and I ripped off one side of each of these work pieces, and then I had to clean up those bandsaw marks using the jointer plane. And in doing so, I made sure that I kept everything square and straight. And that part that I cleaned off with the jointer plane then became my reference edge, which I then ran across the fence on the bandsaw to cut the piece to its final width. And now I have bandsaw marks on the opposite edge of each of these work pieces that need to be removed, as well as maintaining squareness and straightness. And that brings me to a little trick I'd like to share with you. So I'm going to get everything all lined up, and hopefully you can see it on the camera. Failing that, hopefully I explain it well enough that you don't need to see it on the camera. All right, so I've oriented this workpiece such that you're looking right down it, and at the opposite end of my workbench, back that away, I have a work light that's pointing the other direction. It's this raking light. And I hope that allows you to see these bandsaw marks okay. Because there's a little trick I like to do for removing bandsaw marks while ensuring that I'm staying square and flat. So what I like to do is to just start planing it with my joiner plane. And I actually use those bandsaw marks as indicators of whether or not I'm remaining square while I'm removing those bandsaw marks. And right now, it appears that most of them are going away on this edge, but not on this edge, which means I need to focus more on this edge with my joiner plane in order to keep things square. There's still a little bit right there, and there's just a kind of a rough patch of grain right here. Still a little bit right there. I think I need to adjust my blade just a tiny bit. Now these bandsaw marks are all just about completely gone, so I'm going to check now to see how square I am. And they are dead square, so the trick worked pretty well in this case. Just need to make sure I'm straight here, so I'm going to put a straight edge over it. And it appears that it is a little bit high through the middle here. So I'm going to remove some material there. And I think I'm going to take a little bit lighter cut while I'm doing that. That leaves a little bit cleaner edge. It remains dead square. And still a little bit high right in here. Short, a little bit longer, a little bit longer. Getting real close. Looks like it's just a smidgen high right here. Short pass, longer pass, full pass. Still square. Perfectly straight. So now that workpiece is ready to go, and all that remains for me to do now is to cut off the ends nice and square. I left these over long just for that purpose. So I'm going to take this over to the track saw now and knock the ends off, cutting these to full length. Now that bandsaw trick works so well, not only for keeping it square, but keeping things straight and parallel to the other edge, that I no longer even bother with marking it with a marking gauge. So what you would normally do is take a reference edge, set your marking gauge to your final width that you want your workpiece to be, mark that out, and then plane down to that line with your jack plane or your jointer plane. And that way you know that this edge is parallel to this edge. But if you use that bandsaw trick, if you got your bandsaw nice and tuned up, you can avoid all of that just by removing the bandsaw marks in the way that I showed you. Now I'm going to put this Anchor T rule on here, and I'm going to look to see if I'm indeed at my final width, and I am. And then I'm going to slide it along here and just kind of eyeball that final width and make sure that it remains that final width over the full length of the workpiece, and it does. So this thing is just perfectly parallel edges and ready for cross-cutting. All right, so I took all the stock for my sled feet and my battens over to the track saw, and I cut them to final length, nice and square. Now all these parts are ready to go. They are surfaced on all 6 sides, flat, parallel, and square, and they're ready to have the joinery marked out on them. So in determining what thickness I want my tenons to be, it's a little bit different than if I were joining 2 parts that are the same thickness. Say you're joining 2 parts like this and they're the same thickness. The typical rule of thumb for that is to take 1/3 of the thickness of the material and make that the thickness of your tenon. Now this is a little bit different because I'm going to be joining a leg to a sled foot like this, and that sled foot is significantly wider than the leg is. That gives me a lot of meat on either side of where my mortise is going to be and allows me to use a much thicker tenon. I can use most of the thickness of this leg to be a tenon. I do want a little bit of a shoulder all the way around it to kind of hide where the tenon enters the mortise a little bit better. But other than that, I can make it as beefy as I want. So what I ended up doing was measuring the width of my sled feet, which is about 8 centimeters, dividing that by 3, and that ends up being about 26.6 millimeters. And that got me thinking, see, that's suspiciously close to what an inch is. An inch is 25.4 millimeters. So I ended up deciding on about 28 millimeters to be the thickness of my tenons. And then I proceeded to mark that out on the end of one of my legs. And I'll show you how I did that. I just put it in my leg vise. I guess it's the leg vise in more ways than one, this way. And then I got out my woodpecker center finding rule, marked the center line of that. And then I measured over 14 millimeters, and I set my marking gauge so that it lined up with that just perfect. Since my track saw typically cuts straight across the board, but not necessarily in this orientation, this might not be square across here. Rather than play with fire and risk that getting all goofed up, what I like to do is take marking on my edge. Let's see here. And since I know that these 2 faces are parallel to each other and that this edge is square to those 2 faces, I went ahead and marked a line the same on all 3 sides here. On this side, I'm not necessarily going to be square because this is the curved side of the leg. Nevertheless, I still put a mark there because all of the strength that I'm relying on in this joint is coming from the tenon cheeks, not so much from the sides of the tenon there. So I went ahead and marked all around the edges so I have a nice little shoulder all the way around it. And then I needed to transfer my lines over the edges down to where the length of my tenon is going to be. And the way I like to do that is because my track saw doesn't necessarily cut the end of this perfectly square. You know, normally I would cut this on the track saw and then take it over to my shooting board and then use my shooting board plane to make sure that this is perfectly square from both this face and this face. I can't really rely on that with oak though. It's so hard that it just makes a mess of things when I try to use it on a shooting board. So especially with this much material here. There's a ton of material that I would have to remove with my shooting board plane, and that typically doesn't go well. So what I'm going to do instead is mark from the end of this corner here, and this is my reference edge, this is the straight edge of the leg, back to what I want the length of my tenon to be, and put a mark across that. And then rather than use a marking gauge all the way around the edges like this, rather than mark it around like that, it's much safer, not knowing if this is square or not, to lay it down with the square. This square's not big enough. Let's try this one. Lay it down with a square and mark it with the stock on my square on the reference edge here. So I mark it this way with a marking knife. Do the same across here. Mark it. Turn it over one more time and then flip the stock of my square. So that's again referencing off of my reference edge and marking that. And that's how I marked out the lines where my shoulders are going to be on here. And then I took a mechanical pencil and traced in all those lines so they can be seen better. Let me see if I can show you another example. See that? I like to do that, particularly on the faces here, because oak is such a coarse wood, it's so coarse-grained that it's really hard to see those marking gauge lines or knife lines as the case may be. So I like to trace them in with that mechanical pencil just to make them easier to see when I'm actually cutting them out. These marking lines across the grain are easy enough for me to see, so I don't really trace those, but I trace all the other ones. And these are ready to be cut now, but I'm not going to cut them yet because, like I said all along, I like to cut my mortises first. So I need to get mortises that are the same size as these tenons marked out on those sled feet. So now I need to transfer those tenons over onto these sled feet in a way that they will be centered both on the width and on the length of the sled foot. So I know what distance I want between these legs here, and I need to find the center of the sled foot in order to mark that out. So what I like to do for that is to break out this handy dandy device. This is a center finding rule. Basically you have on one edge of this rule you have a 0 marking, and it measures out upward from that center point, that 0 center point. So all I have to do is drop this on my sled foot and make sure that's the same distance from 0 to each edge of the workpiece. Very careful, I'm going to mark that right about there. And then I need to do the same thing over its length and measure the distance and make sure it's equal on either side of 0 here. And I got the center finding rule from Lee Valley way back in the day. I presume they still carry it. I do find it a little bit more straightforward than trying to measure the distance and dividing it by 2. As much as possible, if I can avoid math, I'm going to do that, because that just gives another opportunity for error. There's the center right there. And I just need to mark that out. Side is my reference edge. There's my reference edge. I put a little mark right there. So I'm measuring off of this side for the center line right there. Let's see if my ink or T rule lines up to this. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because I did mill this to be basically 8 centimeters wide. The center line is 4 centimeters in. Go figure. So I didn't really need to do that with the center finding rule, but whatever. So I'm going to draw that center line. Now I know I want the distance between my legs to be about 4 centimeters, so I'm going to go ahead and mark that. On my ink or T rule here, I have up to 5 centimeters that I can mark with this, and there's these little laser cut holes. I can see through that little slot, and there's no way I'd be able to get this on camera, but basically I'm looking through this little laser cut slot to see this center line that I marked here, and then I can mark over 2 centimeters in both directions from that and put a little tick mark. So once again, the ink or T rule has come to save the day. Whoops! And there you go, I just dropped it. That's okay, it's durable as well. So now I'm going to mark those, like so. So that's the gap between my legs. And now I need to add the width of this shoulder here to that line to mark where the inside edges of my mortises are going to be. And I happen to know that those shoulders are 7 millimeters, and the reason I know that is because I still have my marking gauge set up to the distance that I marked all of those with. And if I take a ruler to it, I can see quite clearly that is like exactly 7 millimeters. So that worked out good. So I'm going to mark 7 in either direction from that. And again, the ink or T rule comes in handy. So I'm going to line it up with one of the even number slots. We'll say the 20th slot and come in 7 from that. That's going to be the 3 on this side because it's counting up from 0 on this edge. So there's that 7 millimeters in. Here, let me put this one on the 10. So I'm looking through that laser cut slot and lining it up with that line. I can see the center line this way through all of these slots. There is 10, And I'll mark to 17, which is right there. I almost marked 18 there. Oops. That's where, those tick marks is where the inside edges of my mortises are going to be. I probably should be marking with a marking knife. Now sometimes people get hung up on making sure that the bevel of their marking knife is on the right side of the joinery. Technically, the bevel of this marking knife should be facing into where the mortise is. That's a whole level of OCD that not even I will stoop to. It's really not a big deal if the bevel on your marking knife is facing out of the joint there. It's never going to be seen by anybody ever once this joint goes together. Now, if you'll recall from earlier, I made the thickness of my tenon a little bit wider than 1 inch at 28 millimeters, right about there. So I want to mark 14 millimeters from either side of the center line here. And that will be where the mortise cheeks go, I suppose, if you want to call them that. And again, I can mark that with the ink or T-rule. So I'm going to use the 5 here, the 25, because this is 5 centimeters wide. Line it up with the window and mark it out 14 millimeters from either side of that. So that'll be the 1 on this side. And then we'll go from 25 out to the 9 on this side, 39. And that is the width of my mortises. So I have a tick mark there and there for the width of my mortise, and I could use my ink or T-rule to draw that pencil line to mark out the side of my mortise, but I prefer to use knives or marking gauges in this case. So what I'll do instead is take a marking gauge and line it up to the inside edge of that pencil line and just mark that out. But I don't know where to terminate this yet. I need to mark the outside edge of my tenons, so I don't just put a marking gauge line way out here on my sled feet where it's going to be seen later. So I need to mark that distance for the width of the, or the length of the tenon, I should say. So if I come over here and measure the length of my tenon, that ends up being about 47 almost exactly. That's just what it ended up being. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the length of that onto here. And again, I like to use a T-rule for that. So I can line this edge up to the inside edge of my tenon. I can see that center line right through those laser cut slots. And I can mark to 47 right here. So now I have that edge as well. Now I'm just going to go ahead and mark that with pencil. I'll deepen it with knife. Again, where's my reference edge? Reference edge is that side, so I'm going to put the fence of my square on that side and mark that out. And then I'll take my marking gauge, and now I know where to stop as I mark that in. So there's one cheek. Obviously you want your mortise, if anything, to be a little bit narrower than the tenon is, because then you can kind of take a tiny bit off the cheeks of your tenons until it just fits nice and snug. And then just to double check myself, we know that my tenons are about 28 millimeters thick. So I'm going to measure from knife line to knife line and see that it is indeed 28 millimeters. X marks the spot. So there it is. And I'm going to do the same marking techniques over here to mark that one. So at this point, you might be wondering to yourself why this guy on YouTube spends so much time talking about marking and measuring ad infinitum. It's kind of boring. I'll tell you why, because it's the key point in any project where it's most easy to just royally F it up and cost yourself dearly in terms of hours spent, money spent on materials, and of course the materials themselves. If a furniture project turns out wonky, it's almost always because somebody didn't take the time to do their measuring and marking quite correctly. So it behooves you to think about your measuring and marking before you do it, while you're doing it, and after you did it. We've all heard that old adage that you should measure twice and cut once. That's pretty sage advice for somebody who's doing a rough carpentry, but when it comes to precision furniture making, it's more like measure as many times as it takes in order to feel comfortable about what you're doing before you start cutting stuff. Don't make me shake my marking gauge at you, young man. Pay attention. Carrying on. So, while I'm still in the measuring and marking mindset, I decided to go ahead and mark out the tenons and the tops of my legs. And here you can see what those look like. And there's a bit of a rule of thumb in the woodworking world about how wide of a tenon you can get away with before the expansion and contraction of that tenon threatens to blow apart the joint. And that rule of thumb seems to be about 4 inches or so. I don't really regard that as a hard and fast rule of thumb because really the expansion and contraction of that tenon depends a lot upon factors like the species of wood. For instance, white oak actually moves quite a lot compared to some other woods. And it can also depend upon the alignment of the growth rings. So if the growth rings go straight across the tenon this direction, that's going to expand a lot more than if it's like this where they're diagonal. This is more of a rift sawn board. That will move more than if the growth rings went straight through the thickness of the wood, what we would call a quarter sawn. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. Now, these tenons aren't anywhere near 4 inches. They're closer to 3. This is actually 8 centimeters wide. And one of the reasons I didn't go even wider than it is currently is because I wanted to avoid the horn on the leg here. So if my tenon was much wider, there wouldn't be much base below it, kind of supporting that corner of the tenon, and I don't want anything breaking off of this edge here. There's some short grain here. So I have my tenon shifted over to where there's more kind of support underneath the tenon right there. So that's what's going on there. And that brought me to the next step, which is to mark out where the mortises are going to go in my battens. And made me think of a little tip I'd like to share with you. This is one side of my mortise here. I have a little knife line that you probably can't see, so I'm going to just trace that really quick. And so, like I said, that tenon is about 8 centimeters wide, and I want to transfer that same 8 centimeters to here, and I want to do it pretty consistently for each of the 4 tenons, or sorry, the 4 mortises that I need to do. So one of the ways I like to do that is rather than kind of eyeballing this ruler here and seeing how it lines up with my pencil line, because I have a knife line here, I'm just going to drop my knife into it. And it's no different than if I was using a square. You know, normally you would drop a knife into an existing knife line, move your square up to it, and widen that knife line. What I'm doing here is a similar thing. I'm just dropping my knife into that knife line and butting up my ruler against it, like that. And now I know that I'm measuring pretty consistently when I measure out each of these mortises. So I'm going to put a little knife point right there. And again, you probably can't see that, but there's a little divot for my knife right there. And now I'm in a position to mark that out, like so. But if I use that same trick of butting up the ruler against my little knife lines that I have here and here and here, then I'm going to have a consistent mortise length on each of these battens, and away I go. Okay, so I have all of my mortises marked out on my battens and my sled feet, and I'm ready to start chopping them. And it's at times like these I feel inclined to issue a disclaimer that the way I'm showing you how to do this is far from the only way to do this. When it comes to mortises, you could do it any number of ways. You could chop this out entirely by hand, although that would take you quite a bit of time because you'll have to stop a lot to sharpen because this is white oak and it tends to blunt chisels quite a bit more quickly than a lot of other woods do. I mean, if you're that hung up on doing it the handcrafted artisanal way, I suppose you could take it so far as to go out into the wild and harvest some beaver teeth and use those. Conversely, there are all kinds of machines that will do this as well. The first that comes to mind is the hollow chisel mortiser, which is a one-trick pony of a machine that is designed to cut square holes. So if you're doing a lot of mortise and tenon work, you might want to look into that. Of course, you could do this with a router using like a slot mortising attachment. I could probably adapt my domino joiner to cut the bulk of these mortises as well. But the way I like to do it, that I've settled on over the years, given the equipment that I have, and what just makes sense to me, is to use the drill press with the Forstner bit mounted up in it, and remove the bulk of the waste with that, and then come in and clean up the rest of the mortise with chisels. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's head over to the drill press and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so I have my drill press all set up here. I got a 1-inch Forstner bit tightened down in there, and I've adjusted the speed of the drill press to match up to the recommended RPMs for that bit. And then I have my workpiece such that I have my mortise locations marked, but also a center line down the length of the board. And what I did was look down the board from this end and make sure that this spur, the center point of this first Forstner bit, lines up with that center line just perfectly, and I can just touch down right on it. And then I set my fence to that distance. And now I can slide my workpiece back and forth along the fence and keep that exactly on the center line. And as I spoke about earlier, I have my mortise sized such that it's just a little bit wider than the Forstner bit is. So I'm very close to my layout lines, but I'm definitely not bumping up against them because I don't want to risk overcutting those so much. So now I'm basically ready to go. Oh, and I also have my depth set. So it's just shy of poking through the other side of the workpiece. So I'm using as much of the thickness of these sled feet as possible to give me some glue surface for the tenons. And the reason I don't do a through mortise is because I much prefer to have a closed-end mortise that kind of keeps the glue in the joint. When you do a through mortise, the nature of the joint tends to push the glue out the back side of that through mortise, and I want this to be as strong as I can make it. So I'm just going just shy of poking through the other side. And then it's just a matter of starting it up and doing overlapping holes right up near the end line of each of these mortises. So these mortises are pretty big. Normally what I would do is just slide down, drill a hole, slide down, drill a hole, etc. But there's so much waste coming out of these holes that it's kind of hard to do that. So I'm just kind of working one at a time and then clearing the waste out of the way and doing it like that. So I've got one edge of the hole right up near my end line that I've laid out here, and then I'm going to do the same on the other side. And then I'll take a pass at the middle to see if I can't remove the little waste that's left over on these walls here. So let's give that a shot. I'm going to be standing in a mountain of shavings by the end of this. It's all good. I'd have to make sure that there's no shavings between the workpiece and the fence. Obviously that can kind of goof you up. So now I have a little bit of waste here and a little bit of waste here, and I'm hoping I can take the remainder of that out with a Forstner bit as well. But failing that, it's not a big deal. These little horns are kind of, they're pretty easy to remove just with a chisel, just paring it. So we'll give it a shot. If it's like vibrating too much or the bit feels like it's trying to deflect really hard, then I'll give up on that, but let's give it a whirl. Not bad. Okay, so I've drilled out the rest of these mortises, and as you can see on these battens, the mortises are quite a bit longer than they were in the example that I showed you at the drill press. So I'll put some pictures up on screen so you can see the order in which I like to drill the holes. I'll always establish the holes at the ends of the mortises first, and then drill a hole directly in between them, kind of in the middle, and then keep splitting the distance until I've gotten to where the walls are pretty clean. And the reason I like to do that is if I were to come in here and just drill at one end and then overlap holes working my way down to the other end of the mortise, there's a chance that when I get to that final hole, the Forstner bit is going to try to follow the previous hole. It won't quite line up the way I need it to. And I can't quite get the Forstner bit as close to the end line as I'd like. So I find it always a little bit easier to do the ends first and then just keep splitting the distance in between them. Now I'm going to go and sharpen up some chisels and show you how I like to remove the rest of the waste. Okay, so I'm all set up to do some chopping and get rid of the rest of the waste in these mortises. And so I've got my workpiece over here on my bench right on the right hand leg of the bench, right over the top of it, because it's the stiffest point from which you can do any chopping and not have your bench give way. There's a direct connection right into the floor from here. If you were to do your chopping out in the middle of your bench, there's always a chance it's going to kind of give way under the force of the chopping and not be as efficient. Even though I built my bench with a top that is ridiculously stiff, this is still a good habit to be in. So I got everything nice and clamped down, and I grabbed a couple chisels. And I'll talk about the widths of chisels that I chose for this operation in a moment. And then I also got a square out, and this is an adjustable dovetail square from Sterling Toolworks. Let me get you a good look at that. So these are great not only for dovetails, but for all kinds of joinery, because that little adjustable blade is nice and skinny and fits down into the mortises. And this is a good tool from which to judge if you're paring the walls of your mortises nice and square. So that's super handy. And then I got my 12-ounce What is Good mallet, and this thing is freaking awesome. and not super expensive either. So I'm going to put an affiliate link in the description in case you want to pick one of these up. I've had this for my entire career and still going strong. It's just got a couple marks on the urethane, and other than that, it's looking nice and dandy. It's been great. Can take a beating. So let me bring it a little bit closer. We'll talk about the chisel widths. So as far as the width of the chisels I chose is concerned, I grabbed a chisel that is about half the width of the mortise this way, because one of the trickiest parts of doing mortises this way is getting rid of these corners here. And those corners make up, of course, about half the width of the mortise in that direction. And then I got my fattest, widest chisel here. This one I believe is about 1 inch. And that's for paring away these side walls. And on the side walls, the wood is going to give away much more easily, so I can use a big wide chisel to do the paring without encountering too much resistance. Okay, so this is how I like to go about removing the waste from these. I have a chisel kind of nice and sharpened up here, and it's not, you know, razor sharp, but I do like to touch it up before I get going on this kind of thing. And what I want to do is remove these rounded off corner areas first and try to work my way back into these corners. So I'll just kind of pick a corner of the chisel and just back it up a little bit like that. And you can see I'm angling the chisel into that a little bit because it wants to ride back out of the material. And then I'll back up just a little bit from that. Tap that down and continue backward. Back towards my end line back here, and removing material as I go along. See, it likes to back out of there, so it's good to kind of angle the chisel into it a little bit as you go. Oh. Let's tighten down my hold fast a little more. Now I'm going to work back on the other side. So I've stopped just shy of my knife line right there. And now I'll do the same thing on the other side. So I've kind of pared it back just shy of the knife line. And before I take those final passes, I like to come in here with a wider chisel and remove some of the waste that's on the sides here. And you can see that the drill bit that I used left kind of a fluted surface here. So you can actually keep an eye on that fluting, and you can see how close to perpendicular to the surface you are by how much of that fluting is left as you're paring. So you can kind of use that as an indicator of how perpendicular you are to this outside surface here. So I'm going to stand up and remove all that fluting as best I can. And when most of that is gone, I have to get the top started. So I'm close enough to my knife line there that I should probably just be tapping this. So I'm going to go ahead and drop my chisel right into that knife line. And while I'm at it, I'm so close to the knife line on this other side here that I'm going to go ahead and knock that off too. And I don't usually start right in the corner. I usually start somewhere in the middle. Yeah, that's going to require some hand paring because I'm so close to that knife line already. There we go. Start removing some of this. And work towards this back corner. And I presume you could already see that. I'd already worked my way to this knife line on this end of the mortise, so right into the corner. Now I just have to work the rest of the way back to that knife line. So I'm going to sit down, bring out my narrow chisel again. I'm going to go right down the middle of this. Now I'm eyeballing for vertical, but it tends to want to undercut into the end grain a little bit, and that isn't a big deal to me. What's really important here, as far as the way the joint goes together and how strong it is these side walls here and here. The end grain here doesn't really do much, and if it's undercut, it actually makes it easier to dry fit. your workpiece and pull it apart again later, because typically when we pull apart a dry fit mortise and tenon, we're wiggling the workpiece kind of this way to get it loose. So no biggie if your end grain is a little bit ugly down here. As long as it's either vertical or undercut a little bit, it's all good. Right there. So now I got most of this fluting removed. I'm going to start using my square to see how perpendicular it is to the surface and removing any high spots with just light paring. And of course then I want to turn it around to make it easier to pare this opposite side as well. So we'll do that second. I gotta get all this crud out of here first, because right now it's preventing me from dropping the square down in there. So I'm gonna do that, and then we'll hand pare this down the rest of the way. All right, so I've removed a lot of that material. Now I can fit my square down in there, and I can see how close to vertical I am. Over here I have a lot of material still in the bottom, so I'm just gonna hand pare this just with hand pressure, as opposed to tap, tap, tapping. And remove the material that appears to be high at the bottom of this corner here. Try to lever the waste away, and then rinse and repeat until I got it good. So it appears this a little bit thick right here. I can actually feel that with my finger too. So I'm looking, eyeballing down in here. I can see where material is high. I can check with the square, and I can even feel where it's high in a lot of cases. This white oak is so chunky. It's a little bit ugly right there, and it's a little bit high right here. You can see what this process is like. I'm sneaking up on vertical mortise walls. If your mortise is long enough, you can stick the chisel down in here at an angle, slide it into the end and lever it out that way. If I undercut these corners a little bit deep, not a big deal either. Again, it's all this surface area in here that I want to be nice and vertical. Ooh, that was a close one, man. I almost undercut that when I was paring it away. So it's a good thing that didn't happen. So I need to flip it around and do the other side. So if you're new to this, you might be wondering to yourself, what do you do if you screw this up? So what if you accidentally undercut the sidewall of this? Well, that's one of the reasons that I prefer to cut my tenons after I cut the mortises, is because I can always make a mortise a little bit wider. I can come in here, I can adjust a marking gauge such that it's just like a 0.5 millimeter wider than the original mortise, and nobody would ever notice that. I can always make a mortise bigger, but I can't always make a tenon bigger, at least not easily. So I find it easier to start with the mortises, and that way if anything goes awry, I can just kind of adjust on the fly. And then I go ahead and cut my tenons a little bit oversized and pare them down to fit the mortises, whatever width they end up being. But in almost all cases, you can adjust the width of a mortise a little bit wider without affecting the structural integrity of the joint. Okay, so that concludes this episode, and I hope you picked up some pointers along the way. And if what you got out of this video after watching it is that you definitely don't want to cut mortises the way that I just showed you, that's totally fair. Honestly, I kind of feel the same way myself. That took a lot of work, and I just stopped to sharpen my chisels a whole bunch, which is not really my thing. I think the way I showed you is the way that a stubborn user of hand tools would do it if you didn't own mortising chisels and was a little bit too lazy to do it entirely by hand. As such, this method is probably the second least efficient and accurate way to cut mortises. Likewise, if I weren't so lazy, I probably would have figured out a way to do it with my router. Now, my router is probably not big enough to do these huge mortises, but I think in the long run, that's probably the way I prefer to do it. And since we're talking about preferences, of all the myriad ways there are to do mortises, I think the way I would prefer to do it is with a Panta router, which I don't own, but if you do a little search of Panta router on YouTube, there's all kinds of videos about it. It's a unique little machine that I often lament that I didn't buy as opposed to the domino joiner that I have currently. I feel like there's a lot of other things I could do with the Panta router above and beyond just cutting mortises and tenons. All that said, this is all water under the bridge now. I've got my mortises all ready, and in the next episode, I'm going to be cutting out the tenons, and I hope you'll join me for that. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos, you might like one of those. Thank you for watching.